Imagine being 19 years old. No experience. No medical degree. No background in science. And walking into a room full of the most powerful investors in the world. And convincing every single one of them that you had invented something that would change medicine forever. She said her device could detect cancer, diabetes, and hundreds of diseases from just one single drop of blood. No needles. No labs. No waiting. Just one tiny drop. And you would know everything about your health. In minutes. Investors gave her millions. Then billions. The media called her the next Steve Jobs. Forbes named her the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. Presidents invited her to dinner. World leaders asked for her advice. She was on every magazine cover. Every stage. Every headline. For 10 years. Elizabeth Holmes was the most celebrated entrepreneur on the planet. There was just one problem. The device didn't work. It had never worked. Not even once. And while the world was celebrating her, real patients were receiving false medical results. Making life-changing decisions based on complete lies. This is the story of Elizabeth Holmes. The greatest fraud in Silicon Valley history. And the most chilling reminder that not everything that shines is gold. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in 1984. In Washington, D.C. Into a family that breathed ambition. Her father worked for Enron. Her great-great-uncle was a famous surgeon. And from the very beginning, Elizabeth was different. Not just smart. Different. At 7 years old, when other children were drawing pictures of princesses, Elizabeth drew blueprints. Detailed. Precise. For inventions she wanted to build someday. At 9 years old, a relative asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. She looked them directly in the eye and said, "A billionaire. Not a doctor. Not a scientist. Not an astronaut. A billionaire." At 14, she was learning Mandarin Chinese. Not because her school required it. Because she decided it would be useful. She had a plan. She always had a plan. Her family was comfortable. But not extraordinarily wealthy. And Elizabeth grew up watching the truly powerful. The Rockefellers, the Fords, the Gateses. From a careful distance. Studying them. Learning from them. Wanting what they had. Not just the money. The legacy. The impact. The feeling of having changed something fundamental. About the way the world works. She enrolled at Stanford University. One of the most prestigious universities on earth. At just 17 years old. She studied chemical engineering. And in her very first year, she started working as a research assistant. In a laboratory. Testing blood samples. Learning how medical diagnostics worked. And somewhere in that laboratory, surrounded by needles and test tubes and machines, an idea began to form. A big idea, the kind of idea that either changes the world or destroys the person who has it. Elizabeth Holmes was about to find out which one. Because in 2003, at just 19 years old, she walked into her professor's office, dropped her scholarship on his desk, and said she was leaving Stanford. She had a company to build. Her professor tried to stop her. Her parents begged her to stay. Her friends thought she had lost her mind. But Elizabeth Holmes had never listened to anyone in her life. She was not going to start now. She called her company Theranos. A combination of two words. Therapy. And diagnosis. She was 19 years old. She had no working product. No proven technology. No medical license. No clinical trials. No approval from any health authority on Earth. Just an idea. And a voice. That voice. See, Elizabeth Holmes had discovered something. Very early in her life. That the world does not always reward the most talented person in the room. It rewards the most convincing one. And Elizabeth Holmes was the most convincing person anyone had ever met. She had deliberately trained her voice to sound deeper, more authoritative, more serious. She wore the same black turtleneck every single day. A deliberate imitation of Steve Jobs, the man she idolized above everyone else. She maintained unblinking eye contact in every meeting. Intense, focused, unwavering. Like she could see straight through you. Straight through to the future. And she was simply waiting for you to catch up. And when she spoke about her vision, about a world where no one would ever have to be afraid of a needle again, where a single drop of blood could save your life, people did not just believe her. They were moved by her. Her first investor was her Stanford professor. Then a family friend. Then another. Then another. The money began to trickle in. Small amounts at first. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. Then something extraordinary happened. She got a meeting with Don Lucas, one of the most powerful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. She walked in. She sat down. She looked him in the eye. And she talked. Not about technology. Not about clinical trials. Not about science. She talked about her grandfather, who had died of cancer, because the diagnosis had come too late. She talked about fear. About pain. About the millions of people who avoid doctors. Not because they don't care about their health, but because they are terrified of needles. She talked about a world where that fear no longer existed. Don Lucas wrote her a check. And then he introduced her to his friends. By 2004, Theranos had raised nearly $6 million from people who had never seen the technology work. Because the technology did not work. Not yet. Elizabeth told herself it would. She told herself she just needed more time. More money. More brilliant minds working on the problem. And so she hired them. The best scientists. The best engineers. The best minds that money could buy. And she put them in a laboratory. And she gave them one instruction. Make it work. But the human body does not negotiate. Science does not negotiate. One drop of blood is simply not enough to run hundreds of medical tests accurately. The physics did not allow it. The biology did not allow it. Every scientist in that laboratory knew it. They told her. Again. And again. And again. And Elizabeth Holmes looked at each one of them with those unblinking eyes and told them to try harder. Because failure was simply not something she was willing to accept. Not now. Not ever. The clock was ticking. The investors were waiting. And Elizabeth Holmes was about to make a decision that would change everything. A decision that would take her from the cover of Forbes magazine all the way to a federal courtroom. She decided that if the technology could not be made to work, she would simply pretend that it already did. For 10 years, Elizabeth Holmes built a world out of smoke and mirrors. And it was magnificent. From the outside. By 2013, Theranos had raised over $700 million. Its valuation had reached $9 billion. And Elizabeth Holmes, a college dropout with no medical degree, was worth $4.5 billion on paper. The board of directors of Theranos read like a list of the most powerful people on the planet. George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of State. James Mattis, four-star U.S. General. Henry Kissinger, one of the most influential diplomats in American history. These were not ordinary people. These were people who had spent their entire lives making the most consequential decisions in the world. And every single one of them believed her. The media was even more intoxicated. Fortune magazine, Forbes, Time, The New Yorker. Every major publication on earth ran breathless profiles of this extraordinary young woman who was revolutionizing medicine. She gave a TED Talk. The audience gave her a standing ovation. President Obama appointed her a U.S. ambassador for global entrepreneurship. Vice President Biden visited her laboratories and called them stunning. She had done it. The girl from Washington, D.C., who had drawn blueprints at 7 years old, had convinced the entire world. But inside Theranos, a very different story was unfolding. The laboratories were not stunning. They were a nightmare. The Edison machine, Theranos' flagship blood testing device, was so unreliable that laboratory staff called it the Theranos. A machine so unpredictable, they named their own jokes after it. When Theranos ran blood tests, they were secretly using conventional machines made by other companies. The same machines that required large amounts of blood. The same technology Elizabeth Holmes had claimed to have replaced. Scientists who raised concerns were fired. Employees who asked too many questions were threatened with lawsuits. The laboratories were divided into sections, with strict rules about who could talk to whom, so that no single employee could ever see the full picture. It was not a company. It was a controlled silence. And then came the patients. Real people. Sick people. Frightened people. Who walked into Walgreens stores, where Theranos testing centers had been set up, and gave their blood, trusting that the results they received were accurate. A man tested for HIV, received a false positive result. He spent weeks believing he had the virus, living in terror, telling his family, planning his future around a lie. A woman tested for cancer markers, received results so wildly inaccurate that her doctor nearly prescribed chemotherapy she did not need. These were not statistics. These were human beings whose lives were being altered by a machine that did not work, run by a company that knew it did not work, and had decided that the truth could wait. And still, nobody on the outside knew. The investors kept investing. The media kept celebrating. The board kept nodding. And Elizabeth Holmes kept smiling. That same intense, unblinking, unflinching smile. But somewhere, in a quiet office, in a small newspaper, a journalist had started asking questions. Questions that nobody at Theranos wanted to answer. His name was John Carreyrou. He worked for the Wall Street Journal. And he was about to pull on a thread that would unravel everything. On the 15th of October, 2015, John Carreyrou published his article. One article. In the Wall Street Journal. And the world Elizabeth Holmes had spent 12 years building collapsed in 12 days. Investors panicked. Partners pulled out. Walgreens canceled their contract. The board went silent. Government regulators stormed the laboratories. What they found inside confirmed everything. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice charged Elizabeth Holmes with multiple counts of criminal fraud. In January 2022, after one of the most watched trials in American history, she was found guilty. The girl who had stood on every stage in the world was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The $9 billion valuation went to zero. The $4.5 billion personal fortune gone. The magazine covers. The standing ovations. The presidential appointments. All of it dissolved. Like a single drop of blood. On a laboratory floor. And here is what this story really teaches us. Not that ambition is dangerous. Not that women in Silicon Valley face unfair scrutiny. Not even that investors should ask more questions. It teaches us something simpler. And far more uncomfortable. That the most dangerous person in any room is not the one who knows they are lying, it is the one who has convinced themselves that the lie is temporary. That the truth will catch up. That the ends justify the means. Elizabeth Holmes did not wake up one morning and decide to hurt people. She woke up every morning and decided that her vision was more important than the truth. And that decision destroyed everything, including herself. Every chapter has an ending. This one ended in a federal courtroom. But the lesson belongs to all of us. This has been Untold Chapters. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe. Because the next chapter is already waiting.